A city of 300,000 people, mostly wood, almost no stone, and a summer that had barely rained. That combination did not cause the Chicago fire of 1871 on its own, but it made what happened next almost inevitable. Chicago in 1871 was one of the fastest-growing cities in the world. It had doubled in population within a decade. The buildings went up fast because speed was the point. Lumber was cheap. Brick took time. Time was money. The math was simple. Roughly two-thirds of Chicago's structures were made entirely of wood. That included thousands of homes, warehouses, grain elevators, and sidewalks. Even the sidewalks, wooden planks, raised above the mud, running block after block. The city knew this was a problem. Fire inspectors had said so repeatedly. Reports warned of crowded wooden districts, inadequate water pressure, and too few firefighters. One inspector submitted a formal warning just months before October 1871. It was noted, filed, and nothing substantial changed. The summer of 1871 had been unusually dry across the upper Midwest. By early October, Chicago had received barely a quarter of its normal rainfall. The wooden city was not just dry, it was primed. On the night of October 7th, a serious fire broke out on the city's west side. Firefighters worked through the night. By morning, they had contained it but barely. The equipment was strained, the hoses needed repair. Then, less than 24 hours later, another fire started. The origin point was a barn behind a house on DeCoven Street, on the southwest side. The famous story says a cow owned by Catherine O'Leary kicked over a lantern. That story was printed in newspapers within days of the fire. It spread faster than the fire itself, and it was almost certainly invented. A reporter later admitted he fabricated the cow detail to make the story more vivid. Catherine O'Leary was investigated by a city inquiry and cleared of any deliberate wrongdoing. The actual cause of ignition on October 8th has never been definitively established. What is known is that a fire started near the O'Leary barn, sometime around 9 in the evening. The wind that night was strong and coming from the southwest. It caught embers and carried them northeast, directly toward the city's dense core. The fire department received the alarm late. The initial response went to the wrong location. By the time crews arrived at DeCoven Street, the fire had already moved beyond the barn. It crossed the Chicago River, which most people assumed would stop it. The river did not stop it. Burning debris flew over the water and landed on the other side. The business district caught. Then the north side. Then the waterworks. The city's water pumping station burned around 3 in the morning on October 9th. Once that went, the fire hoses went dry. The firefighters had almost nothing left to fight with. The fire burned for roughly 30 hours before rain finally arrived on October 10th. By then, approximately 17,500 buildings had been destroyed across nearly 4 square miles. Around 100,000 people, a third of the city's population, were left without shelter. The death toll is estimated at between 200 and 300 people, which is lower than many expect. Most people fled on foot north toward the lake, carrying what they could. The lakefront became a temporary refuge for thousands of displaced residents overnight. Those who could not move fast enough, the elderly, the ill, were at greatest risk. The financial loss was estimated at roughly $200 million in 1871 terms. Several insurance companies collapsed immediately, unable to cover what they had underwritten. That detail matters. The disaster did not just destroy buildings, it exposed a financial system built on assumptions. The assumption that a modern American city would not burn this completely, this fast. Chicago did not stay empty for long. That part is worth understanding clearly. Within days, lumber was arriving by rail from cities across the Midwest. Tents went up. Temporary shelters followed. Then framed buildings. Some structures were rebuilt so quickly that construction began before the ash had fully cooled. The speed of recovery impressed outside observers, and it was real. But speed was also exactly the problem that had created the disaster in the first place. The city government faced an immediate and uncomfortable question. If you rebuild fast, you rebuild the same way. And the same way had just burned. The Chicago Common Council began debating new fire ordinances within weeks of the disaster. The first version of the new building code required brick and stone construction in the central district. Wooden construction was banned outright in a defined fire zone covering the burned core. That sounds obvious in retrospect, Before October 1871, it had been politically impossible. Property owners had consistently blocked stricter codes, arguing they raised construction costs. After the fire, that argument became much harder to make with a straight face. But the new ordinance still faced resistance, and that resistance is historically interesting. A significant number of working-class residents, many of them immigrants, had lost wooden cottages. They wanted to rebuild quickly and cheaply, meaning wood, the same material as before. In November 1871, a group of residents actually burned down a newly constructed fireproof building in protest. The protest was against the ordinance that prevented them from rebuilding in wood on their own lots. The city temporarily relaxed the rules under political pressure, then tightened them again. It took several years and multiple revisions before Chicago's building codes reached genuine stability. This, back and forth, is not a failure of history. It is how contested policy actually moves. The fire created the political opening. The politics still had to be fought through. What emerged in Chicago became a reference point for city planners and engineers across North America. Other cities had been debating similar codes for years. Chicago gave them a catastrophic case study. Boston had suffered its own major fire in November 1872, just 13 months after Chicago. That fire also burned through a dense wooden commercial district, despite Boston's older and stricter standards. Two major American cities, gutted within 14 months. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Insurance companies, which had taken massive losses in both fires, began demanding proof of fire-resistant construction. That financial pressure, separate from any city government, pushed builders towards stone and brick. The market and the law were moving in the same direction, which is when building codes actually stick. Chicago also accelerated a different kind of rethinking, one about height, structure, and material. The city's rebuilding coincided with the early development of steel frame construction techniques. Architects and engineers working in Chicago during the 1870s and 1880s were solving the same problem. How do you build a large, fireproof, structurally sound building efficiently and at scale? The answers they developed contributed directly to what became known as the Chicago School of Architecture. The fire did not invent the skyscraper, but it cleared the ground, literally and financially, for new thinking. Land in the burned district was valuable. Investors wanted maximum return per square foot. Steel frames, fire-resistant cladding, and elevator technology made taller buildings economically viable. Within 20 years of the fire, Chicago had buildings that would have been unimaginable before 1871. None of that was planned in October 1871. It emerged from constraint, pressure, and opportunity. That is how a lot of urban change actually happens. Not from vision alone, but from forced reckoning. The fire also changed how American cities thought about fire departments as public infrastructure. Before 1871, many fire departments were still partially volunteer organizations with inconsistent equipment. Chicago's department had been underfunded and understaffed relative to the city's growth. After the fire, professional full-time departments with standardized equipment became the expected baseline. Water supply infrastructure, pressure systems, hydrant placement. All of it came under new scrutiny. Cities began mapping fire risks the way they had previously only mapped streets and property lines. The idea that a city government had an obligation to manage fire risk as a systemic problem was not new, but Chicago made the cost of ignoring that obligation concrete, measurable, and politically undeniable. Some details of the fire's timeline and cause remain debated among historians. Eyewitness accounts from 1871 conflict on specifics, and some early reporting was shaped more by drama than accuracy. What the evidence does support clearly is the chain of structural failures, not just the flames. A city that had outgrown its own safety assumptions, built on speed, optimism, and cheap materials. A warning system that existed on paper and failed in practice. A disaster that was, in several senses, predictable. The fire is remembered as a catastrophe. It was. But it was also a stress test that the city had been failing quietly for years. What Chicago built afterward, in law, in stone, in institutional expectation, became part of how modern cities are governed. Not because anyone planned it that way in the wreckage of October 1871, but because the alternative, rebuilding exactly the same city in waiting, was no longer something anyone could honestly defend.